Hello, everyone. Welcome to a long overdue edition of Generation Jihad. I'm your host, Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. Today, we have a special guest. It's Edmund Fitton-Brown. He previously served as the United Nations Security Council's coordinator for its analytical support and sanctions monitoring team, as well as the United Kingdom's ambassador to Yemen. Edmund is currently an advisor to the Counter Extremism Project, and Edmund is probably our most frequent guest here at Generation Jihad. Edmund, welcome to Generation Jihad.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be here again.
Always great to have you, Edmund. Really looking forward to today's discussion. Part of the reason this episode is long overdue is we were anticipating this report. It was delayed again. And I was trying to keep the time slot open so that Edmund and I could be very agile to do this. And unfortunately, it took my focus off of getting you a podcast out on a regular basis. So I apologize for that. Today, Edmund and I are going to discuss the monitoring team's 14th report on the groups and individuals that pose a threat to Afghanistan. That, of course, includes, but not limited to, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State Khorasan province, and the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan. Edmund, I think you'll agree with this report. It's extremely interesting, but at the same time, to shall I say, terrorism nerds like you and I, not very surprising. But I will say there's some great new facts, great details within this report. Some of this I knew. It's good to see some of the names that come out of this. And then I think that when you look at the analysis of the team, I'm always a big fan of the sanctions and monitoring team's reporting. I think they make an excellent effort to dig to the bottom of the truth, and they have a lot of pressure from a lot of different governments on what they're putting out. And I think it's a fantastic product. You've always put out a great product, Edmund, and anyone who knows me knows I'm not a guy who blows smoke. And I think that's why you're here. That's why you're a regular. What are your thoughts on the latest report, Edmund?
Yeah, well, thanks, Bill. Thanks for those kind words. And I feel the same. I'm proud of the team for what they've done. It is the first Afghan report that they've done since I left last summer. And it's also the first Afghan report, or 1988 report, as we call it, because of the sanctions regime being set up by Resolution 1988. It's the first one that covers a full year of the Taliban in control. So the last one that I was involved in a year ago covered the changeover. It included the period from May to August 2021, before the Taliban took over, and then it talked about the 9 months since then. This time, it's a full 12 months of Taliban control. When I read it, I agree with you. I was impressed by the detail. I wasn't surprised by very much of it. It seems to me to be a very interesting and methodical building upon some of the things that we said a year ago.
Yeah, look, first, you really passed the torch well. I don't think they've missed a beat. It must have been really difficult for you doing that report last year with that transition. Tell us a little, is that correct? Tell us a little bit about that. You had an Afghan government, it was doing things, you had to negotiate, and then all of a sudden it all collapses. And is that the case? Was that a difficult report to put together?
It was difficult. I mean, it really was. And one of the things that makes these reports difficult also is that at the moment, the 1988 committee, which covers this issue, is on a year-to-year rollover. The mandate is only 1 year long, and it keeps being extended every December. So we were in this weird situation from May 2021. We knew that we were probably going to have to write another report in April 2022, but we didn't know it for sure. It was possible that in December, the Security Council might have decided not to extend the mandate. So, of course, we were working actively on Afghanistan throughout the year, but still, you can't help being mindful of the possibility that the mandate will lapse. Now, when the Taliban took over, of course, that was a shocker for everybody. I mean, no matter what capacity you were observing Afghanistan in, that was an absolute shocker. And, we had so many contacts. Most of our access inside Afghanistan was with the former Afghan authorities. And so we then watched these poor people, being scattered to the four winds. And in some cases, of course, suffering horrible consequences of the Taliban takeover. So that was traumatic. And of course, we then had to think through what happens next, as did the Security Council. The Security Council, who we work for, they had to sort of pass various resolutions figuring out how to continue to manage the situation in Afghanistan, despite some of the difficulties that exist on a sort of a geostrategic level, particularly between the Americans and the Russians and the Chinese. But they did a pretty good job of it. They kept passing resolutions. They were mainly rollover resolutions. And when they got to the monitoring team's mandate, they went ahead and extended. And we wrote the report in April. We had a lot of material from pre-August, which was from direct access inside Afghanistan. It was the period after August was harder. We had to rely more on reporting from well-placed member states like, Pakistan, like China, like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, France, Germany, the United States, the United Kingdom, Turkey, lots of countries that have deep knowledge of Afghanistan and a deep stake in Afghanistan. And sure enough, when the time came to write the report in April 2022, I think it was pretty good. We were pleased with how it came out. Now, I felt for the guys taking over from me and having to do a whole year without a trip to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So, I wasn't sure how hard it would be for them this time. But when I read the report, I was very, very pleasantly surprised. I think the quality has held up.
Yeah, I concur. Now, so before we get to the report itself, just one quick follow-up question. It was fascinating you explain when you're discussing how the mandate may not be renewed. Do you think it's possible that given the Taliban building ties, particularly with countries like China and probably to a lesser extent, Russia, that could be some pressure within the Security Council to not renew the mandate? Would China have the ability to kill this on its own?
So it would require, the mandate of the monitoring team is only renewed for a year, and therefore it doesn't require a consensus to kill the monitoring team on 1988. You could just not agree to a new mandate. So that could happen by default, it could lapse. But it's not really, the monitoring team isn't the issue, because if you think about it, all that the monitoring team does is it provides the Security Council with independent expert reporting on Afghanistan, which pretty much everybody in the Security Council agrees they need.
Right.
What's more controversial is should the sanctions continue? But the sanctions don't lapse. It would have to be a positive Security Council resolution to kill the sanctions regime. So no one country can do that.
You answered my question. Let's dig into that's very interesting. So just to be clear, I'm going to summarize that. It would require a government. I'm assuming it would require it to get all 5 of the key members of the Security Council to agree.
Absolutely. If somebody wanted to abolish the sanctions regime, it would require a Security Council resolution, and that could be vetoed by any of the P5.
Okay, great. All right, that's good to know. I mean, that is somewhat comforting, because I got to tell you, these guys need to remain on these lists. A lot of them are, particularly the key Taliban leaders, are deeply tied to Al Qaeda, and this report gets into some of that. Some of the new names that are popping up, not new to you and I, but popping up in this report, aren't even sanctioned. So,
by the way, Bill, I mean, to reassure you, I think that because people, they don't want to alienate the Taliban, particularly the neighboring countries. They worry about, making sure that they don't incur the sort of like a sort of vengeful approach from the Taliban. So in many cases, they probably say things that the Taliban want to hear. But we know from private conversations, even with countries that sometimes sound as if they're somewhat sympathetic to the Taliban, or that the ones that talk about, maybe it's time to normalize relations and all that sort of thing. Maybe it's time to recognize. But we know that actually almost all of those countries actually value the sanctions regime because they know it gives them leverage. They know that if the Taliban behave unreasonably towards them, then they can sort of turn around to the Taliban and say, look, you're the pariahs, not us.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I always the Chinese put on a very good public face, but I know from watching their dealings with Pakistan, particularly, that they do like to keep a certain arm's length. They're willing to do transactional relationships with nefarious countries, China being a nefarious country itself, of course, but they're not going to fully get into bed and join the team. So I would expect the Chinese to not push hard in order to end the sanctions regime. They're not going to get it anyway, so they're not going to pick a fight that they're going to lose. Yeah, I just would hate to, as you detected my concern, I would hate to see these reports end. They're just too good. If the information that's released and the more we know, the better we can, even if our governments aren't willing to take the fight to the Taliban at the moment, is the more information we have in case it's needed in the future, the better. And I'm a big believer in public understanding. Yeah.
I completely agree, Bill. And one thing I like about this also is that the Taliban, they don't like these reports and they react to them. And you probably saw that they've reacted already to this one. And what I love about that is, I think they think they're good at propaganda and good at public relations. But to some degree, if you read their denial, because instead of a sort of a more nuanced response, which would be credible, it's a blanket denial of everything that's said in the report. And in doing it, they've sort of summarized the main points of the report to remind people of what they're accused of. And B, of course, the way that they've ordered it, they actually show the points on which they are particularly sensitive. And it shows that these reports hurt them and that they do offer leverage.
Yeah, I concur. I mean, one of the things I've documented is Taliban denials of al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan, of al-Qaeda leaders. I mean, they make claims like, well, al-Qaeda hasn't been here since the U.S. invaded in 2001. They all left. Meanwhile, I could sit here and document scores of senior al-Qaeda leaders and mid-level commanders who, and I have done this, who have been killed in Afghanistan during raids. Of course, Ayman al-Zawahiri, of course, being killed in a safe house run by an associate of the deputy emir of the Taliban, who was also their interior minister, I believe it was July 2022. They are very sensitive to it. The problem is no one seems to really hold their feet to the fire, but anything that puts them on the defensive, in my opinion, is good. And also, again, I just am a big proponent. We need to understand these groups. There are people on the inside, in the US and the UK and in India and all these countries, and Tajikistan and Uzbekistan are deeply concerned. And the more information they have to deal with these threats and understand the nature, the better.
I love these reports also. And it's partly because what these are is a periodic declassification of intelligence. So this is penetrating reporting that has been cleared for use by the monitoring team. The monitoring team then publishes it. So the one thing it is not is policy. And that's great because it means that member states that maybe their policy is paralyzed or struggling to figure out what do we do about this, this challenge that Afghanistan presents. But the great thing about monitoring team reports is that they give an unvarnished account of what is actually happening. And that then feeds into a more educated policy debate.
Yeah, I concur with that. I've always, one of my biggest complaints in doing this job for so long is, I often see facts are manipulated in order to get policy. And this reports like this, there's no, as you noted, no policy involved in here. This is what's happening, Now you do with that information as you must. That's to the governments, right? But here's the facts on the ground, and that's what I respect. Let's get into the discussion. We could talk about this all day. I mean, we haven't even touched the report itself, but let's start doing that. The first item on the report is a discussion of the Taliban's enduring ties with Al-Qaeda, as well as the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan. And it mentions other groups as well. There's a fascinating discussion in there of, it identifies three key leaders who are, the report describes them as Al-Qaeda associated, but it's doing it in a section where it's talking about how Al-Qaeda leaders are serving within the Taliban government. There's an individual who's in the defense ministry who's using Al-Qaeda training. He's actually identified as Al-Qaeda, not identified by name, but using Al-Qaeda training documents. And he's an actual Al-Qaeda member. So, this shows these, that these links. Let me quote from the report here. It's a quote: "The link between the Taliban and both Al-Qaeda and Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, or that's the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan, remains strong and symbiotic. A range of terrorist groups have greater freedom of maneuver under the Taliban de facto authorities. They're making good use of this, and the threat of terrorism is rising in both Afghanistan and the region," end quote. I would also add, Al-Qaeda is always, and particularly is playing a long game here. It's a threat not just to Afghanistan and the region, but globally, because as they build this capacity, they're always looking outward to expand its caliphate and, of course, use these attacks. It calls Afghanistan, it says Al-Qaeda views Afghanistan as, quote, a safe haven, end quote. This is no news to listeners of Generation Jihad. To you, to readers of the Long War Journal. We've been talking about this for years, but it really is refreshing to see such definitive language being used by the sanctions and monitoring team. What are your thoughts on that, Edmund?
Yeah, no, I think it's important that we restate this regularly. And of course, we have done, as you know, regularly in previous reports, not just 1988 reports, but also the 1267 reports on ISIL and Al-Qaeda globally. And it's important to remind people that there is this very, very close relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, that in some cases, they're more or less dual-hatted, effectively. You don't know where Al-Qaeda ends and the Taliban begins. This is particularly true of Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, where they'll be fighting alongside the Taliban, and you may not immediately be able to tell whether somebody's Al-Qaeda or Taliban, or effectively both. And then the close association of Sirajuddin Haqqani, who is, as you said, the de facto Minister of the Interior, deputy leader of the Taliban, extremely close association with Al-Qaeda over many, many years. And the fact that Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, was in Kabul and in a guest house associated with Sirajuddin Haqqani. This thing just has to be restated again and again, because otherwise the Taliban's regular mantra and propaganda that there is no presence of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and that there are no foreign terrorist fighters in Afghanistan, some people start to almost believe it, because I think on the basis that if you just repeat something often enough, some people say, well, maybe it's true. And of course, the biggest single item in this report, albeit it's a long time ago, way back in July, it is the killing of Zawahiri, which was the ultimate explosion of the Taliban lie that Al-Qaeda are not present in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and the Taliban still haven't admitted that he was killed there. They said, well, we'll investigate, and then they've said nothing. Here, I'm going to note something from the report that talks about this symbiotic relationship. It says the Taliban is providing Al-Qaeda members with, quote, monthly welfare payments, end quote, and, quote, Afghan passports, and I'll just use the term for it because it's probably a blow pronouncing it, national identity cards. Now, just keep in mind that the Ministry of the Interior, which is controlled by Sirajuddin Haqqani, he's the one that issues passports and identity cards. This is just stunning. Another part in this report, again, I mentioned this earlier, there are three leaders who they've identified as Al-Qaeda associated. This is what the U.S. military used to call dual-hatted Taliban and Al-Qaeda, Taliban/Al-Qaeda leaders. So they had feet in both camp. One of them is Qari Barial. He's now the Taliban's governor for Kapisa province, a central province just north of Kabul. This guy's pedigree, he was one of the co-leaders of the Kabul Attack Network. This was the group that launched attacks in and around Kabul. They pooled resources with Al-Qaeda, movement in Taliban in Pakistan, Lashkar-e-Taiba, a host of groups that operated in the area. They pooled resources to conduct attacks against what was then the International Security Assistance Force, and then it became Resolute Support, Afghan civilians, Afghan government, Afghan military, and some of these were staggering suicide assaults. He also was a guy who, and I testified in a case where victims of from U.S. soldiers and civilians who were killed or wounded who sued Iran for its support of the Taliban. Qari Barial was a key figure in this. He took money from the Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force to execute those attacks. He was also identified as the Taliban's Northern Zone commander. He's one guy. So this is one of the dual-hatted Taliban commanders. There's another key individual, Hafiz Hakim. He's the Taliban's governor in Nuristan. Keep in mind that that's a key province for Al-Qaeda. A lot of Al-Qaeda shelter in northeastern Afghanistan and Kunar and Nuristan. My sources tell me he's associated with Mullah Zakir, a former Guantanamo detainee. When he was freed, shortly after he was freed in 2007, he took over the Taliban's military in the south. He was basically the Taliban surge commander. So this guy Hakim reported directly to Zakir. He's so Hakim, a nasty individual. And then there was another individual mentioned who's Tajmir Jawad. He's the deputy director of the intelligence, who reports to Sirajud Haqqani. He was also a co-leader of that Kabul attack network. The U.S. military was targeting. I checked. I think the earliest I went back to was 2013. The U.S. military is trying to kill this guy. He may have been targeted even prior to that. So yeah, these are dual-hatted Taliban Al-Qaeda leaders that are embedded in the Taliban government. And then this report, I'll quote from it real quickly. Quote, Al-Qaeda members have received appointments and advisory roles in the Taliban's security and administrative structures, end quote, including, and quote, then it talks about that unnamed training director within the Ministry of the Defense. This is the integration of the Taliban, or integration isn't the right word. Well, actually, yeah, the Taliban is integrating members of Al-Qaeda into its security structure. They're giving these individuals, these Al-Qaeda leaders, the ability to give Al-Qaeda all the resources they can want. I'd love to see the full list of individuals that might be. I'm hoping that at some point the UN, the Sanctions and Monitoring Team, provides some more information. But this is what I have been warning about. And the report also mentions, I believe, Edmund, it says that there's Al-Qaeda training camps operating as well. And I reported on one of those, and that was also in the UN report. What was his name? He's the guy up in northeastern Afghanistan.
Abu Ikhlas.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah.
And that was in the last report. He's an individual who was in jail at Bagram, and he was freed and went right back to his role as building his Al-Qaeda cadre in Kunar and Nuristan. So it's really some really dangerous stuff.
It is, and to add to all of that, Bill, it's worth mentioning, isn't it, what the report says about the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Pakistani Taliban as well.
Yes.
So Al-Qaeda's got its finger in all of these very threatening pies. They are, as you say, being incorporated into Afghan structures. There's no accident about the way that Siraj took over the Interior Ministry. The Haqqanis were all over Kabul right at the time that the Taliban took over in August 2021. And they went straight for the Interior Ministry, for the intelligence services. They wanted the portfolios that would give them control over nationality, passports, identity cards, etc. And, this has a lot of benefits for a terrorist organization like the Haqqani Network, which, let's face it, the Haqqani Network, although technically not sanctioned by the UN as a terrorist organization, it is nevertheless sanctioned as a threat to peace and security in Afghanistan. And by gaining those levers of power in the new de facto authorities, it gives them all sorts of options, including providing passports in whatever name to terrorists who might travel, something we should bear in mind for the future. It may not be an immediate threat, but it's a potential threat. And then, of course, they have another option it gives them, which I don't think they've done it yet, but it's something I suppose they could do over time. They've always denied there are foreign terrorist fighters in Afghanistan. Well, of course, if they control nationality and passports, then they could, if they wanted to, over time, prove this by making them all Afghan nationals, at which point they could say there really are no foreign terrorist fighters. But that doesn't mean they would be any less dangerous.
No, listen, Tajmir Muhammad or Tajmir Jawad, Qari Barial, Hafiz Hakim, they're Afghans. Just because they're Afghans doesn't mean they can't be Al-Qaeda. This has always been something Absolutely. That's driven me nuts, that if they were an Afghan, they couldn't be Al-Qaeda. Like, Al-Qaeda has this is why I always think, and we'll get into the estimates, I think that the estimates have always been understated. And we'll get into that. I always view the numbers that are given out as a good starting discussion point. But my experience is these generally are underestimated or misunderstood. Let's move on to the section of the report that discusses the Taliban and counterterrorism. As we all know, the individuals like Zalmay Khalilzad, basically the man who's responsible for the deal with the Taliban, the Doha deal, that the so-called peace agreement with the Taliban that was anything but peaceful. They've advocated that the Taliban can be a partner in counterterrorism. And here's what the UN report says about this. I'll quote from it again. While they, of course, being the Taliban, have sought to reduce the profile of these groups that have conducted operations against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, Khorasan province, in general, the Taliban have not delivered on the counterterrorism provisions under the agreement for bringing peace to Afghanistan between the United States of America and the Taliban. Of course, end quote. Of course, that's the Doha deal. I would argue not in general. The Taliban have not delivered on the counterterrorism provisions whatsoever. The only reason the Taliban delivers anything on the Islamic State Khorasan province is because they're mortal enemies. The Islamic State doesn't like the Taliban because it won't swear allegiance to its emir and join the Islamic State. The Taliban doesn't want anyone to get in the way of its rule in Afghanistan. So that's the only, if the Islamic State turned around and tomorrow and said, hey, you know what, we could coexist. We're not going to attack you. We're cool with your thing. Just, leave us alone and we'll leave you alone. I guarantee you the Islamic State Khorasan province would not be a problem for the Taliban. This part, I would say this might be understated, but I think if you read between the lines here, the sanctions and monitoring team are saying, don't trust the Taliban to be an essential partner when it comes to counterterrorism.
Yeah, that's exactly what they're saying, Bill. And they say it in terms, and they also make that, the point that, how can you possibly work with a counterterrorism partner which seems to reserve the right to decide who they consider to be their enemies, the terrorists they're willing to target and those that they're not. The association with Al-Qaeda that we've just been talking about earlier, already invalidates the idea that the Taliban could be a sincere counterterrorism partner. I mean, we're certainly not ready to say that ISIL is such a big problem that we all think that actually Al-Qaeda is okay. They're not okay. That is not the view of the international community. So, and I think you're exactly right when you say that the thing that really sets the Taliban off about ISIL-K is that it's a rival. And it undermines their ideological message. The ISIL-K accuses the Taliban of being godless nationalists, basically. And the Taliban don't like being accused of that. And they don't like the fact that the ISIL-K sort of is undermining their ability to demonstrate that they control Afghanistan fully. So those are the reasons they don't like them. If you were, let's imagine that we went down that track of working with the Taliban as a counterterrorism partner. The first thing is that the Taliban would never be honest with you about the reality on the ground. So you would be effectively signing up to counterterrorism operations in which you were partially blind because your counterterrorism partner, the Taliban, were lying to you about who was what and what they were doing. And we know from the way the Taliban behaves, particularly towards Uzbeks and Tajik Afghans, we know that they are happy to, as it were, point the finger at people, at their enemies, and say those are terrorists. And then when there's somebody that they like or somebody that's convenient for them, they're not going to agree that those are terrorists. So you run the risk that you get involved in some kind of operation that's actually targeting somebody who has been identified for purely malicious reasons, nothing to do with them actually being a terrorist. The other point is, when people talk about counterterrorism, and what does that actually mean? Counterterrorism operations, they need to be governed by certain principles, to be things that the West can actually engage in. It's not good enough to say, there's these bad guys and they're called ISIL-K, and let's pay the Taliban a load of money or give them a load of equipment to go out and kill them. That is non-compliant. It has nothing to do with counterterrorism. That is simply extrajudicial killing, and extrajudicial killing that is entirely under the control of the Taliban and targeted by the Taliban. So I often think that people who talk about the Taliban as potential counterterrorism partners presumably just know nothing about what counterterrorism operations involve.
I couldn't agree with you more, Edmund. That's well said. Look, at the end of the day, you can't trust terrorists to fight terrorists. The Taliban has used suicide attacks against civilians, against the coalition, against the Afghan government. These suicide attacks were key in degrading the legitimacy of the Afghan government and the Afghan security forces. The Taliban still says that it has suicide bombers in its ranks. They call them martyrdom seekers or fedayeen. And this is what you're going to trust. That's absolute madness. This is wishful thinking from people who, particularly in the case of someone like Zalmay Khalilzad, who's still selling a bad deal that he was the architect of, and that would be that Doha agreement that paved the way for the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. This is Generation Jihad. Today's guest is our good friend, Edmund Fitton-Brown. He's the former coordinator of the United Nations Security Council's Analytical Support and Sanctions and Monitoring Team, as well as the United Kingdom's former ambassador to Yemen. And he currently serves as an advisor to the Counter Extremism Project. Edmund and I, of course, are discussing the Sanctions and Monitoring Team's latest report on the threats and individuals posed the threats posed to the state of Afghanistan today. Edmund, let's move on to the report notes, and I'll just read from it. These reports are so well written, I may as well, instead of summarize them, I may as well just quote from them. Here it goes. It's about Al Qaeda's rebuilding its capabilities. Quote, there are indications that Al Qaeda is rebuilding operational capability, that the TTP, that's the movement in Taliban in Pakistan, is launching attacks into Pakistan with support from the Taliban, that groups of foreign terrorist fighters are projecting threats across Afghanistan's borders, end quotes. And a lot of those groups, of course, are groups like the Turkestan Islamic Party, Ansarullah, which is a Tajik group. There's a group forming up that's somewhat new. It's called the Tehrik-i-Taliban Tajikistan, or the Movement of the Taliban in Tajikistan, Islamic Movement Uzbekistan, Islamic Jihad Union. We go on. And of course, the Pakistani groups that still operating training camps. These are terrorist groups that are Harkat al-Mujahideen, which the State Department, this isn't mentioned in the report, but previous reporting has noted that the groups like Harkat al-Mujahideen was running training camps in Afghanistan. So again, not surprising. The report does note had something interesting, that the Al Qaeda may feel at some time that it's constrained by the Taliban and may seek to move senior leadership. But I don't think we're anywhere near that, and particularly when we're seeing Al Qaeda leaders being integrated into the Taliban's security and administrative structures as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Bill. I mean, I agree. I agree with that. I think. When we talk about constraint, I suppose you can say that the Taliban probably has the ability to say to terrorist groups inside Afghanistan, don't do stuff that will cause us a problem, don't do stuff that will embarrass us, that will surprise us. So maybe there's some element of constraint operating in that respect. And this is where I think you have an interesting geometry operating. And you referred to all of those groups. like TTP, like ETIM, like IMU. All of these groups pose a threat to neighboring countries. So they're usually, if it's Uzbeks, it's targeted against Uzbekistan. If it's Pakistanis, it's targeted against Pakistan, etc. And from the Taliban's point of view, these are their friends. They're their comrades in arms. They are the people that they sympathize with ideologically to a large degree. And they're not willing to do anything really harsh against these people. They don't want to shut them down. They don't want to expel them. They don't want to imprison them. They want to continue to be their friends. And yet they need, if they are going to rule Afghanistan, they need some element of cooperation with those neighboring countries. So at the same time as they're friends with IMU and friends with TTP, they also want help from Islamabad and help from Tashkent. And this is the tension that the Taliban are trying to manage. How do we stay friends with our friends whilst hoodwinking our neighbors into going easy on us? That's the kind of calculation they're trying to make. And then the final complication of this calculation from the Taliban point of view is that ISIL Khorasan is waiting in the wings with a sort of a siren message, a rejectionist message, saying to these guys, we are the true resistance. We are the people who want to continue the fight. The Taliban they're compromising. They're not real jihadis.
They're holding you back.
They're holding you back, exactly. And so the Taliban is terrified that both people from these groups and people from the Taliban itself will defect to ISIL-K. And that also is one of the reasons why the Taliban have done such a poor job of actually adjusting to the reality of government.
Yeah, it's certainly a balancing act. And Edmund, I have you on because you could read my mind. That was the point I was going to make if you didn't, that this certainly is an opening for the Islamic State Khorasan province to poach from these groups, to go after what I call the red-blooded jihadis, as if there's a cool-blooded jihadi, but whatever. It's certainly an opening. I also think countries like Pakistan particularly are wise enough to know that the Taliban, which it wants to keep in power, which it's managing with its strategic depth, because again, the Pakistanis are willing to endure. Look, during the worst of the Taliban, the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan insurgency from 2007 to say 2015, probably about 100,000 Pakistani civilians, security personnel, government officials were killed in horrific Pakistani Taliban attacks, suicide bombings in just about every major city, a suicide assault on general headquarters. The Pakistanis understood that the Pakistani Taliban was being sheltered and supported by the Afghan Taliban, and yet endured that for the greater good of maintaining strategic depth. So I think whatever happens now, as long as it could be a slow boil, the reality is about, I think, around 900 casualties in the last year in Pakistan. I'm reading a lot of analysis out there where people are saying things like, oh, the Pakistanis can't tolerate this anymore. Well, look, they tolerated up to 100,000 to get its strategic depth. The cynical Pakistani, the deep state, what's 900 a year when they were willing to endure? That's my take on it. So they're going to be tough with the Taliban, but not tough enough that's going to break that relationship. And additionally, the Pakistanis don't want the individuals, don't want TTP members, which they feel the Afghan Taliban can constrain in some way to go to groups like the Islamic State Khorasan province, which they have zero leverage over. So I'm always a little, China, in the case of China, I think Pakistan and China are the two biggest ones from my perspective. China is purely transactional. As long as it feels the Taliban are doing enough to keep a rein on the Turkestan Islamic Party or Eastern Turkestan Islamic movement, whatever you prefer to call them, the China is very happy to get its minerals and its business inside of Afghanistan. For not that the Chinese aren't stupid, and and I think the Chinese would much rather have the U.S. out of Afghanistan, out of its backyard, and a Taliban in control. So they're not. I don't think they're going to overly push hard on the issue. The Iranians would be the third country. I think it's the same dynamic. They really, one of the big reasons they supported the Taliban and Al Qaeda, again, which we proved in a federal court, was to get the U.S. off of its eastern border. It just could not countenance having the U.S. in both Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think they'll put pressure on the Taliban to try to constrain these groups, but not enough to make it untenable so that the Taliban could potentially lose power.
What you describe, Bill, is a sort of it's a variable geometry around Afghanistan.
Yeah.
I think each neighbor feels a combination of similar concerns, but they're in different measures, and some feel more threatened than others. Some have a higher pain threshold or a higher tolerance threshold than others. And in some cases, there'll be an issue that is more important to one country than it is to another. I think when you look at the Iranian Afghan dynamic, one of the sort of underappreciated aspects of that over recent years has been just how many Iranian border guards and anti-narcotics people have been killed because of the narcotics trade that goes across that border. So I think I think that's the interesting thing. The neighbors need to work together. They need to have each other's backs and to help each other to put pressure on the Taliban to behave like good neighbors. The reason that's difficult to do is because all of them have a slightly different mixture of concerns and mixture of interests. And the one thing I would add on Pakistan, I think, is I think Islamabad is disappointed by the performance of the Taliban in power. And I think there's a couple of other components to that. And one of those is that the Taliban has been extremely vocal about their rejection of the border.
Yes.
And that's a problem for Pakistan. And Pakistan finds that, perhaps it's galling, that that the Taliban should show no understanding of the Pakistani position on that. And of course, one of the problems that arises on not just the Pakistani border, we've seen it on the Iranian border too. But there is potential for cross-border violence and potential, potential escalation in some cases. So that's a little bit dangerous, and that's one of the reasons the TTP is so dangerous, because they're operating across that disputed border. And of course, one of the reasons why the Afghan Taliban are not good allies to the Pakistanis on this. And the other point about the Taliban, and the report is really strong on this, is the extent to which the Taliban is degenerating into a Pashtun chauvinist organization. Basically, it's not just its religious ideology, if you like. It is the fact that it is so completely centered on certain Pashtun tribes and exclusive or exclusionary towards others. So if you're a Tajik Afghan Talib, then you're way outside. And nobody cares what you think. Nobody in Kandahar cares what you think or cares about the interests of your constituents in your part of Afghanistan. The reason I make that point is that, of course, extreme Pashtun chauvinism is actually not a helpful impulse in Pakistan either. That is not something that Pakistanis can relate to.
Yeah. And look, there is a senior Tajik Taliban commander, it's Mullah Fasihuddin, who is the chief of staff of the army, I believe. So they do hold some positions, but you're right. They're certainly marginalized. On the point with drugs, and maybe this will be an opening to discuss that briefly. The Taliban and Iran, there's been designations out there, narcotics in the U.S. that have detailed this. Mullah Naim Baruch, who's actually listed he was mentioned in the report. He was working directly with the Iran's IRGC Quds force to run drugs across the border. So the Iranians, the IRGC is the power, the real power that be just like the Pakistani military is in Pakistan. So yeah, the drugs is a problem and the cross-border issues, but at the end of the day, the Iranians, particularly those in power, want to keep those tensions to a low boil, because money's got to be made in that. And let's quickly discuss the portion of the report on the narcotics, and there was also a section on financing as well about the Taliban. Edmund, tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the report, a little bit like the one a year ago, it starts to separate the issue of narcotics from finance. They come together in the report, and the reason they come together is because there is a long history, as you know, of the insurgency being financed by narcotics revenues. But of course, we recognized a year ago, and the team has recognized again now, that the Taliban is not primarily funded by narcotics anymore. It's governing the country. It's the de facto authorities of the country. They're controlling our whole economy. They're controlling taxation revenues. They have the revenues of a state at their disposal, and so it's what that has done is it's changed the way that those two components of the report relate to each other. They're semi-detached from each other now. The interesting point about the narcotics, and I think a little bit going back to what you were just saying about the way that narcotics and the profits from narcotics and the corrupting effect of narcotics, it operates in all countries, of course, but it particularly operates in Afghanistan and in some of the neighboring countries. Where the report is really interesting is, of course, that from an ideological point of view, the Taliban really want to say that they're against narcotics because it's not good for their religious ideological credibility if they appear to be still hand in glove with narcotics. But the report makes it very clear that they still are, and that this is partly because people have got rich off this, and those people were involved in the success of the Taliban, and they're very well connected, and there are untouchables who are directly involved in the narcotics trade, but because of their credibility with the Taliban leadership, in some cases with Haybatullah himself, nobody is going to stop them. Nobody is going to arrest them. Nobody is going to stop their drug shipments. And so this is a really important point. And it's again the ethnic dimension of this comes in as well, because one of the things we saw during my time was that they were, for example, sometimes they were happy to get involved in enforcement operations in Uzbek or Tajik parts of the country because they didn't care about the people who were getting rich off that. They cared about their own, the really well-connected people who were doing it. And some of the people who are sanctioned in connection, partly because they are regarded as key in the narcotics side. These people are very well connected and very senior in the present de facto authorities. And this also touches upon another point, which is the extent to which the Taliban can adapt to administration. Some of them don't want to. If you've got rich off dealing in heroin or in methamphetamines, or the report actually interestingly also mentions fentanyl, I think. If you've got rich off narcotics, do you actually want to sort of go back to being a sort of an administrator who, instead of having all that wealth and power and respect and fear from people, you become responsible. You have to listen to complaints. You have to be accountable. That's difficult. And they're having the same problem with some of the former military commanders. People who the respect of carrying a gun and people being afraid of you. You say to somebody like that, you should become the assistant district commissioner, who listens to petitions from people who say that you haven't built a road in their district. And a lot of them don't want that. And so that transition of an insurgency into an administration is not easy.
Yeah, just a couple of quick details. It mentions Sirajul Haqqani, again, deputy emir of the Taliban, one of two, Mullah Yaqub being the other. That's Mullah Omar's son. Siraj is running meth labs in eastern Afghanistan. He's also the Interior Ministry. What you in effect here have is a narco state. And I think that this is an inconvenient truth for the Taliban, much like its ties with Al Qaeda or the presence of Al Qaeda and other terrorist groups within the country. The Taliban know it's happening and in many ways support it because it keeps those who need to be. Look, if in a perfect world, I think Mullah Habibullah Akhundzada, the emir of the Taliban, would get his perfect Islamic emirate with all the rules being followed, but he knows that he needs to keep those the powerful individuals within the Taliban, keep them happy and keep the money flowing, because he can get a near perfect Islamic state in Afghanistan. But yeah, it's an inconvenient truth that, the Taliban will tell you that probably narcotics are down to zero or they're going to get us there. That's what they did pre 9/11, but everyone knew it was happening.
Well, and Bill, this is one of the reasons again why I enjoyed doing this work, and why I am again delighted to see this report that the team has produced, because this inconvenient truth needs to be shouted from the rooftops.
You're right.
This is one of the things that was so disappointing about the Doha Accords, that this issue, which is a major international security issue, Afghanistan is producing the majority of the world's heroin, and that heroin is turning up throughout North America. During my time, it was intercepted in Canada, and now they're big into methamphetamines, as you were saying. There's talk of fentanyl as well. And so what this report enables the international community to do is to go back to the Taliban and say, sorry, but you are behaving in a way that is directly damaging us. And unless you do something real about this, not just passing decrees or issuing decrees, but actually prove that you are suppressing the drug industry and ceasing, as you describe it, to be a narco state. That is a very good reason not to normalize relations. It is a very good reason not to recognize.
One of many. Let's move on to look. I think, dare I say this? Here in the United States, no one would ever say, I think the Ku Klux Klan is has been reformed, and maybe this is a group that we could work with going forward. No one would ever make that argument, but somehow we can, say the Taliban's going to be a responsible partner in the international community. It's not going to have Al Qaeda ties. It's not going to be a narco state. It's not going to promote other terrorist groups, shelter them. But that's the world we live in. Let's move on to the quickly. We've got three more issues here to discuss, Edmund. The report provides some numbers on Al Qaeda and the Islamic State Khorasan province, as well as the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan. I want to be very clear. I always found numbers to be somewhat squishy, and typically, and particularly in the case of Al Qaeda, underestimated. Don't get me started on how the U.S. government said that Al Qaeda only had 50 to 100 leaders and operatives in Afghanistan, when the U.S. military they did this for 6 years, between 2010 to 2015, until we raided an Al Qaeda camp and killed 150 of them. They maintained that consistent number for years. So I've always been very, very skeptical of these numbers, but I do believe that it's a good starting point. Here's what the report estimates. It says 30 core Al Qaeda leaders, I guess that would be. I always hate this distinction between core and non-core. I guess what they're probably getting at is key leaders, or I don't know if that means, maybe you could shed some light on that. But that, and then about 600 Al Qaeda members, and maybe thousands when it comes to their families and whatnot. And then somewhere around 200 members of Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent are there. That's Al Qaeda's branch in the region. For the Islamic State Khorasan, it says somewhere between 4,000 to 6,000 Islamic State Khorasan province members, and I believe the number was 6,000 for the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan that were sheltering inside of Afghanistan. I suspect the last two numbers are probably pretty accurate, and the numbers on Al Qaeda, in my estimation, are probably low. because again, a lot of times Afghans are not seen as being members of Al Qaeda. One of the things I documented over the years was particularly when the U.S. military was actually reporting on raids against Al Qaeda. They were present in 24 of 34, it was 24 or 26 of Afghanistan's 34 provinces. How do you keep that kind of presence with only 50 to 100 members when you're killing anywhere from 25 to 75 a year? And then 1 year was about 150. Those numbers had to be underestimated. I get it. Some of these are low level members, but Al Qaeda historically has had a significant presence in Afghanistan, and I doubt they scaled it back that much. I could go on, and I'll stop there, Edmund, and we'll ask you what you think about these numbers for the groups.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, Bill, I have the highest regard for the work you've done on this in this area, and you proved over a prolonged period that these numbers were low, and the estimates were low, and you also have talked a lot about dual hatting, and that's really interesting as well. And you're absolutely right. No reason at all why an Afghan can't be a member of Al Qaeda, and many are. Just as many Afghans are members of ISIL Khorasan. There's no reason why that shouldn't be the case, and it is the case. I definitely hear what you say on this. The team's methodology on this is to listen to member states and to try to produce a synthesis of the estimates that are provided by member states. And those estimates vary widely. And so it is, as you say, it's a little bit of a shot in the dark as you try to sort of say, well, we're trying to reach it. We've sort of reached a broad consensus around this figure. And then even once you've got those figures, then the question arises of who exactly are you counting? Are you just counting people who are sort of out there with guns? Are you also counting people who are members or supporters? Are you counting family members, dependents? And so it gets really murky. And I've never liked the figures as they stand, because I've always considered them to be, so approximate. But where it's valuable, and we've discussed this before, where it's valuable is the trend. It's whether you think that the numbers are increasing or decreasing, or whether they're steady. And I think on Al Qaeda, they seem to be more or less steady as far as I can tell compared to previous reporting. And on ISIL, interestingly, they are really definitely saying that those have increased.
Yeah, that used to be around, if I recall, a year or two ago, somewhere around 2,000, I think.
2 to 3,000.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah,
there's more or less a consensus amongst member states that ISIL-K has doubled in strength over the past 2 years. That's the people give various reasons for that. It's partly recruitment. We talked about this. ISIL-K's ability to attract people from other extremist groups, including the Taliban in Afghanistan. They've also certainly been able to attract, I think, probably small numbers, but nevertheless, they have attracted some former members of the Afghan security forces. People, who are desperate, maybe either maybe they're angry, they just want to attack the Taliban, and this is one way of doing it. Or they've got no way of subsisting, and ISIL has money and it can pay them, and they have relevant skills. So there may be an element of that. And then, of course, a big part of the growth of ISIL-K was the sheer recklessness and sabotage of the Taliban when they took over the country, and they simply broke open the prisons. And again, when people say, wouldn't the Taliban be a good counterterrorism partner against ISIL-K? One of the first things that I say to them is, well, it would have been helpful if they hadn't actually let them all go.
That was really a baffling decision to me. I'm really surprised they didn't round them up. I would love to have been a fly on. I wonder if that was just sheer chaos and if they really didn't put much thought into that. But yeah, it happened. Yeah, and I mean, I want to be very clear. These numbers being given on, I think the Islamic State Khorasan province and movement Taliban in Pakistan, I think those numbers they sound right. That sounds, the Al Qaeda numbers may be low, but these numbers are far better than anything ever put out by U.S. intelligence, even going backwards in the past. So I know I'm being skeptical or critical, But this is far more realistic an estimate of Al-Qaeda given by the sanctions and monitoring team here than that ridiculous 50 to 100 estimate put out for 6 years straight by the U.S. government. So, again, I understand, and as you explained, some of the constraints. This is always, I'd love to be a fly on the wall in those meetings and on some of these issues and see where the disagreements lie. Just out of curiosity, I guess that's the geek curiosity part of me, but it must be fascinating and probably at times, as you had mentioned, a little bit frustrating. But again, I still think the product that's being put out here is a best effort, and at times given some constraints.
And also, Bill, I want to highlight, as you said, that estimate on TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, people forget how big that is. It's, it's a lot of people. That's a really strong group, and I would say with, maybe ISIL-K is close, but I would say with some confidence that TTP is the single largest terrorist group in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and that's just what's in Afghanistan too. We're not talking about what's still in Pakistan. And I'm guessing those numbers fluctuate as the Pakistan. That's got to be a difficult one to track as the Pakistani military conducts operations at times. There's a lot of overflow, and I think another thing. I remember, and this is out there in the public too, but I've been told by several members of U.S. military intelligence over time that, the Taliban, when they cross the border into Pakistan, they're the Pakistani Taliban. When they cross the border back in Afghanistan, they're the Afghan Taliban. So, I always found that interesting as well, sort of a force multiplier, with some, just as, the dual-headed Afghan Pakistani Taliban as well.
Well, and again, coming back to the border point, that there are border tribes, and
yes.
and you can actually disagree about whether they're Afghan or Pakistani.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to the report notes that the Islamic State Khorasan province, it's increasing operations and growing threats. I'll quickly quote from it. Quote, the operations of ISIL-K or Islamic State Khorasan province are becoming more sophisticated and lethal, if not more numerous. Edmund, let's talk a little bit about the growing threat of the Islamic State Khorasan province. I've been noticing that they're conducting more attacks, but I'm starting to see a lot less of the high profile attacks, more small scale attacks against the like IEDs or an assassination. But I'm not seeing, at least in the last 6 months, major suicide operations by ISIS-K.
Yeah, I think you make a really important point there, Bill, and it's the one we should sort of at least discuss. Why that might be. Is it? I doubt that that's a lack of capability because as we've said, the numbers are significant. You've got a lot of ISIL-K still, and they are active, and the number of operations is high. I think the assassinations are interesting. They're kind of high profile. And you look at those assassinations, and you want to sort of figure out what was the cui bono, who benefits from this attack, why was this person targeted, and that's some interesting stuff to look at. I think part of ISIL-K's motivation is to demonstrate that they're active and that they cannot be shut down by the Taliban, and I think they've been fairly successful in that. They've been active enough that people continue to take them seriously. So that's kind of a success for them. But mass casualty operations, there hasn't been so much of that, at least not recently. And I'm not sure. Hard to know what the reason for that is, but it's worth remembering that we used to have suspicions in the days when the Taliban was in the insurgency that some of the ISIL-K attacks in which civilians were killed that were claimed by ISIL-K, some of them seemed to bear hallmarks of the Haqqani network. And we come now to the leader of ISIL-K, Sana al-Ghaffari. And people will be aware that there have been recent reports that Sana al-Ghaffari may have been killed probably in some kind of engagement with the Taliban, if it happened. But there's an odd uncertainty around this. Some people have been reporting it. There's been some element of official confirmation from within the region but there are also a number of people who might know about this who are not sure, and don't regard this as confirmed as true. And that leads to the various possibilities, including the possibility that it was not a planned operation, and that maybe this, if he genuinely was killed, it may be that he was caught up in an unexpected, some kind of firefight that broke out, in which he was a sort of an unexpected casualty. So I think we're waiting to see what happened on that. But he is a significant figure because he's been leading ISIL-K for quite a long time. Yeah. And he is a former member of the Haqqani network. So again, we have to remember this complexity. And again, this is another reason why we should be so careful about the idea that the Taliban are a potential counterterrorism partner, because the Taliban is full of factions and elements. And by the way, anticipating your point, Bill, when I say factions and elements, I don't mean these people are at daggers drawn. They are, the Taliban is fairly cohesive, and the level of discipline within the Taliban is still pretty good. So I'm not saying the Haqqani network is in any sense a rogue element of the Taliban. It's very much a part of the Taliban, but it has the tactical latitude to do what it judges to be in the strategic interests of the Taliban, and it'll do it secretly and deniably. And therefore, they will decide who they consider to be worth targeting. And that's part of what I was saying earlier. We could have no confidence that we would know what the calculation was.
Edmund, part of the frustration of knowing if he's dead or not is Afghanistan has just become a big black box for us. It's become so opaque. We used to be able to confirm these types of things far more easily. To your point, no, I understood your point about the Haqqani network. I've heard rumors, and I believe they've been out there, that the Haqqani's networks at time manipulates Islamic State Khorasan province, or may use them as cutouts. So I would have no objection that the Taliban factions, and I would agree, they're factions in the sense of they're different groups within the Taliban, may actually use an Islamic State operative to target one of its rivals. That's not beyond the realm of possibility. But it still doesn't mean the Taliban isn't a cohesive group, as you perfectly mentioned. And one quick final point, I actually think the Islamic State would be more effective in maintaining an insurgency that consisted of assassinations and, IED attacks. The Taliban was very effective doing this. It's really what eroded the support or the strength of the military and the government. Yes, the major suicide raids helped it, but they were, it was more of a public thing. And remember, you were speaking to audiences in the West as well, whereas the Islamic State's really, it's an internal matter now within Afghanistan. But, the Islamic State, again, the estimate's around 6,000. It could be 12,000. It could be 4,000. Whatever. I'll take that 6,000 number on face value. The Taliban can field anywhere from 150,000 to 200,000 fighters. I know previous reports on the Taliban, I can't remember if it was US or UN, but before the Taliban overran the country, people were saying they had about 75,000. Well, I always said, yeah, that number is absolutely wrong when you were looking at the Taliban's attack tempo and operations and ability to seize control of districts and whatnot. So the Islamic State is nowhere near being able to field a force that can go toe-to-toe with the Taliban. Its most effective way of fighting now is to fight a guerrilla insurgency inside of Afghanistan.
Absolutely. And I mean, that point you make, Bill, is worth just underlining that there is a mismatch here. It doesn't, the ISIL-K can survive in these circumstances, but they can't go toe-to-toe with the Taliban. And you do then have to ask the question, what is the greater threat to the international community? Is it ISIL-K surviving in Afghanistan, or is it an extremely well-resourced state apparatus like the Taliban in conjunction with al-Qaeda, which has got affiliates which are threatening the stability of other member states, including Somalia, including Mali, including Burkina Faso. And that is, again, where I get very uncomfortable with the idea of the Taliban as counterterrorism partners, when they are clearly in alliance with what I consider to be the greater long-term terrorist threat, which is al-Qaeda.
For the listeners out there, if this was on video, you would have seen me stifling a laugh, because Edmund made the exact point that I was going to follow up with, that it's the Taliban, and Edmund mentioned this earlier, the Taliban now has the resources of the state. It has U.S. left weaponry and munitions and the military bases. It's taxing and taking money in via narco and all of this. Edmund completely understands this, and I'd love it when someone makes my point for me. Thank you, Edmund.
You're welcome, Bill.
So, yeah, it was well said, Edmund. That was exactly what was on my mind. This is what, we're talking about, recognizing them and dealing with them, and can they be an international partner? And what we're looking at is a terrorist narco state that isn't just interested in controlling Afghanistan, but in supporting groups that want to project power outside of Afghanistan. That is absolute madness, in my opinion, but honestly, nobody listened to me during the Taliban's march to take control of Afghanistan, and I don't expect them to listen to me now. Finally, we'll end our discussion here. I'm going to go do a quick monologue. There's a discussion in the report. It's a significant discussion in there on the internal politics of the Taliban, and essentially what the report is saying, that Mullah Habibatullah Akhundzada is increasingly taking on a dominant role. He's controlling everything from Kandahar. Other key Taliban leaders are being sidelined. I'm pretty much skeptical of a lot of this analysis. The West has been very, very bad at reading the internal Taliban dynamics over time. One of the things that was, preached almost up until the fall of the Taliban, and even after, people were saying, "Oh, the Taliban's going to turn on itself. It's going to internal divisions. That the Taliban's fractured and divided, and there's 20 Taliban, and they can never work together." But that's not what we've witnessed. We've witnessed the Taliban create an interim government. Almost every person given a job is kept it, except the education minister. There's just been turnover at the prime minister, but that's only because the last prime minister of the Taliban is saying he's sick. It's probably true. He is old. It's very possible his health is an issue. I'm not aware of any problems the Taliban had with him. I haven't heard anything about that. My view, I think that the West often overplays certain internal divisions. The report mentions an ongoing feud between Mullah Baradar, who's the deputy, one of the Taliban's deputy. Now he's the first deputy prime minister, with Sirajuddin Haqqani. Look, after the fall of the Afghan government, like within a month or two, there was a report out there that the two came to blows. I mean, and that Mullah Baradar was killed by Sirajuddin Haqqani. Now, look, anyone that knows the Taliban and knows Sirajuddin Haqqani, his goons aren't going to let anyone within 10 feet of him. If a fist was raised to Sirajuddin Haqqani, Mullah Baradar, his family, and his tribe probably wouldn't exist anymore. I think this analysis overestimates the power of Taliban Emir Mullah Habibatullah Akhundzada, particularly at the expense of Mullah Yaqub. Again, that's Mullah Omar's son. He's one of the two deputy emirs, along with Sirajuddin Haqqani. Look, Habibatullah, he knows that he owes, particularly Sirajuddin Haqqani, he owes him for reuniting the Taliban after the Taliban leadership played Weekend at Bernie's with Mullah Omar's corpse between 2013 and 2015. Remember, Mullah Omar died in 2013. The Taliban issued statements under his name for 2 years before it was exposed. Sirajuddin and his father, Jalaluddin Haqqani, basically some groups broke off, including Mullah Yaqub, broke away from the Taliban. It was short-lived, but Sirajuddin and his father, they got the band back together. Habibatullah wouldn't be in power if it wasn't for that. And then, of course, the Sirajuddin Haqqani's key role in the takeover of Afghanistan. Siraj and Yaqub, they were both allotted significant positions within the new Taliban government. They wield a significant amount of power. Yaqub, he runs the defense ministry. Again, Siraj, he runs the interior ministry. We talked about how powerful both of these positions. Habibatullah isn't going to overstep his bounds. He's not going to do anything to alienate either of these guys. He's not going to make a decision that is going to put him at odds with them. And so if Habibatullah doesn't want women's education, or women to be in the workforce, or girls to have education, you could be pretty certain that Yaqub and Sirjun Haqqani are probably on board with that. They're not going to object to it. That's not the hill they're going to die on. But my criticism aside, ultimately, I think the report does a good job of getting the conclusion to this internal, I would say this is like, we're talking about the divisions within a political party here in the West, right? This is a disagreements within the party, but ultimately they're members of the party. That's what we're seeing with the Taliban. And the report does get the ultimate conclusion correct, that the Taliban are very likely to remain united, to remain cohesive. And they say about a year or two, right, is their conclusion. So they get the conclusion right. I think some of the the divisions that they're looking at, I think, are either overplayed. I've seen a lot of where some of that reporting came from. A lot of times it's Afghan watchers who, in my estimation, are looking to manufacture divisions within the Taliban, but the Taliban don't work that way.
Interesting, Bill. I mean, I think you make the point very well. I think one of the things that is certainly true is that those Taliban who are sort of internationally facing, like Sirajuddin, they know how to hold a meeting. They seem reasonable because they're not going to sit there and just sort of scowl at you and call you an apostate or an infidel or whatever. So I think you're right. I think there's a slight tendency in the international community towards wishful thinking. I think this guy's reasonable. I think he's someone we could do business with. I think he's a moderate or whatever it is. I think that sort of thing can be overplayed. And I do think the report comes out in the right place on this. The one point I would make on this is that it reminds me a little bit where you have a sort of an inaccessible sort of religious leader who's sort of, as it were, leading from behind. Hibbatullah is that kind of a leader. He's giving his decrees and his decisions, but he's not accessible other than to a very small sort of coterie of people around him. And it does remind me a little bit of how difficult it is to transact business also with Iran for that same reason, because of the inaccessibility of the supreme leader. And I saw this a little bit with Yemen and with the Houthis, where you might be able to talk to senior Houthis, but you were never going to be able to talk to Abdul Malik al-Houthi. That's where I see a real problem, that as you try to engage with Afghanistan, all of these people that you're talking to, in the end, they're not the source of religious authority. They're not the ones who can actually say a final yes or no on the things that the people are trying to achieve. And I think that is one of the things that bedevils the international community's attempts to make sense of what's happening in Afghanistan at the moment.
Yeah, and so the report also does a very good job of noting, Edmund, that assuming that some of their conclusions are right, that whatever Yaqub or Siraj disagrees with Habibullah on a certain position, ultimately they defer to him, and this is exactly how it worked with Mullah Omar. I mean, he was the final authority. He's the Amir al-Mu'minin. He was right. So this, I think that's why they ultimately get that conclusion right. I think some of the divisions were overstated. And by the way, if this is the way that it is, that Habibullah is making all the decisions behind the scene and he's inaccessible, and Western diplomats are trying to go talk to Siraj or Yaqub or the current prime minister, or whoever.
Baradar.
Yeah, well, Baradar's not the deputy prime minister.
But Baradar has been one of the main faces.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's so influential that he was actually the second prime minister up until recently. If that's the case, talking to them really would be ineffectual. You'd need to go to Habibullah to get the ultimate decision.
But you talk to who you can talk to. That's the thing. And that's why it's so difficult. It's why this kind of leadership is makes it so hard to transact business. One thing I would add on Sirajuddin is that, of course, he's an extremely effective operator.
Yeah.
And his whole history and the history of the Haqqani network has been that they have the latitude to do whatever they judge to be in the interests of the Taliban. They basically interpret what they consider to be the will of Hibbatullah, and they've done it very well and very successfully. And in general, I think there's been a sense that Hibbatullah, as far as one can tell, has, as you say, has considered them to have been very effective in delivering what he wants. I think that gives them a lot of power. It certainly gives them a huge amount of ability to maneuver and to get the portfolios that they want, and to achieve the tactical objectives that they want to. But they won't necessarily be able to deliver strategic outcomes that the foreign interlocutors want from them.
Right. Yeah, the report actually notes that, and I've always felt this as well, that Sirajuddin Haqqani is interested in being a kingmaker and not the king. And that's always been my view of him. He's perfectly fine with being deputy emir, with running the interior ministry. He gets what he wants. He gets everything he needs. He wields power in the way, and he doesn't have to be the big man. I don't think he's set him up for that. I don't, it's possible, maybe 20 years down the line, he's still actually relatively young. I remember when he was first mentioned by the U.S. military, they put a reward out for him for like $75,000 in 2000. I want to say it was like 2006 or 7. And it piqued my interest back then, going, oh, this is Jalaluddin's son, and they actually want him. And then the drone campaign happened in Pakistan, and he was targeted. And then we found out what he was doing in, with suicide attacks and leading military operations in Afghanistan, and became the head of the Miram Shah Regional Military Council and the Shura as well. So yeah, he's certainly a guy who's risen the ranks, but he knows his place. He's comfortable with his place. And you're absolutely, I was again, to the listeners, I was smiling as you were noting, right? These guys they know their place. They get to wield the power they want. They get what they want, and everybody's happy at the end of the day. I would argue that disagreements between the powerful leaders of the Taliban and Habibullah are on the margins, and they're not ones that are going to break these groups apart. All right, Edmund, it's been excellent having you on. Let's get you back on. There's going to be another report issued when? We think sometime in the next month or two.
Should come out in July.
Yeah, well, we're going to get you back on for that one. We'll get it a quick review. Really looking forward to that. And let's get you back on maybe in another capacity soon. We'll talk about that. It's always a pleasure to have you on, Edmund. I've been looking forward to this for 3 weeks now. Really felt bad putting off the podcast. But again, I just really wanted to be flexible for us to be able to pull the trigger on this. And that's how it goes.
We finally did it, Bill, and always a pleasure, and very much looking forward to the next time.
Yep, we'll get you on soon. Edmund, have a great day. And all to our listeners, Generation Jihad, thanks again for joining us. And be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever else you can get your podcasts. Leave us a review, preferably a positive one if we earned it. Thanks again, and have a great day.